Learn how you can save time and tuition dollars with Wilmington University's new Dual Credit Advantage. Go to wilmu.edu/dual credit. Hey, yo, welcome to the Sixers Talk podcast. So glad you could join us. Danny Palmels, Noah Levick, and Ben Berry, the three musketeers, the three amigos, the triumvirate is back together. We'll put the dynasty up a little bit. Hey, listen, it has been a rough season. We are here to try to be your resource for some of the cathartic feelings and the processing of what's going on and what so much has happened since the season has ended. And it's interesting. It seems like every day something trickles out that relates back to the 76ers, but so glad to be with these gentlemen again. We will talk about why Daryl Morey is taking the page out of Brett Brown's book, what to do with James Harden and Matisse Thybulle, and maybe get to Danny Green and going off on Pat Bev. He has such an interesting after game on-court persona and his podcast persona, like two different people. But the Sixers are star hunting again, Noah, Ben. The Sixers are star hunting, taking a page out of Brett Brown's book. Brian Windhorst alluding to the fact on it was the Greeny podcast that he believes the Sixers are in the market or had big plans to add another star. He alluded to the fact that Tobias Harris and Tyrese Maxey may be some names and people who are drawing interest around the league to acquire said star. But he stopped short of naming an actual player the Sixers might be after in order to kind of protect, what he may know. So that's a great place to start because we see the impact the stars are having on the playoffs as if we didn't know. And you see Jimmy Butler going nuts and doing some things that maybe some people thought he couldn't really do in the playoffs, particularly in his last game against the Celtics. Of course, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, and the Celtics have really impressed in the playoffs with Ime Udoka. What do you make of this whole, what seems like never-ending hunt to find the right players to put together to form this great unit to make the Sixers what on paper they should be? Are you guys really kind of caught up in this, or do you feel like it's just more words and you're looking for more substance to back it up?
I'll let Noah go first.
Sure thing. Yeah, I think Daryl Morey, we know his MO is exploring all options. I thought it was even telling at his end of season press conference with Doc Rivers, asked about areas where the Sixers can improve. He initially said defensively, and then he paused for a few seconds and said essentially, I never like to rule anything out. So with Morey, of course, he's going to want to upgrade the roster around Joel Embiid. Of course, he feels a level of urgency to do that because nothing is a sure thing with Embiid, in part because of this continued horrible health luck that seems to befall him over and over again. As far as what specifically might be on the table, clearly, Tyrese Maxey would be the Sixers' most attractive non-Embiid trade piece. And clearly the Sixers have shown that they value Maxey very highly and expect him to continue ascending as a player. So I'd figure it would take a heck of a lot for them to part with Maxey. I don't think Tobias Harris is at all in the same tier. I think the Sixers like what Tobias Harris brings to the table as a versatile defender, are happy with how he adapted his game for the most part next to Harden. But look, he's still quote unquote overpaid, would be a fair way to classify him as a player. And he's got 2 years left on this deal. And if there's some way they can get off of that deal and also manage to get a high quality player in return, sure, in theory, that sounds great. But there's been a lot of change here for the Sixers just over these past several years of the Embiid era. And I think some stability and some sense of continuity and just having all the pieces together for a sustained period of time would be nice. And perhaps that's feasible. And the Sixers can also upgrade the depth around their core players. But look, they've been disappointing. Everything should be on the table. That's what Daryl Morey's all about. And we'll see how this all unfolds. It does seem pretty certain that James Harden will be back in some form. Both sides are on the same page with that. And as we'll get into later, it's just a question of what exactly that will look like money-wise, and then what that contractual situation will enable the Sixers to do in terms of their other options here this offseason.
So, as Danny had mentioned, it was on Brian Windhorst on Mike Greenberg's show podcast. It was referenced there. Daryl Morey brought it up in the press conference, adding another star. I don't think that's necessarily what the Sixers need right now. It might be a big splash. It might get people excited. As Noah just pointed out, Tyrese Maxey being the biggest trade chip the Sixers have outside of Joel Embiid, I thoroughly believe unless you got a top 5 or 10 player back, the city might go crazy because the city loves Tyrese Maxey. He tries. When it seemed like in Game 6, when no one else was trying, it was him and Shake Milton trying. I don't know what stars that the Sixers could get for Tyrese Maxey. I see that Bradley Beal's name has been mentioned a lot before this, going back before the Sixers got James Harden. But you have James Harden and Bradley Beal. I don't see the ball moving around a lot. I don't see it helping on the defensive end of the court all that much. Bradley Beal, fantastic player. I don't think I would give up Tyrese Maxey for Bradley Beal, maybe straight up. But as far as construction a roster that helps Embiid, because that's what I think the focus should be, helping Embiid. I'm not sure what that does. Like the upper echelon players in the league, the Celtics would say no for Jason Tatum. You're not getting Giannis. You're not getting the MVP, Nikola Jokic. And that wouldn't work anyway. Damian Lillard, how healthy is he? His season ended early with the injury. We saw his numbers dip at the beginning of the season once the rules changed. I would be interested in that. If you guys can help me brainstorm, I just don't see all that many options to actually help the Sixers improve without just adding another big name star.
I'm on the same page, I think. That's probably why there was not a ton of specificity in my initial answer, just because I think it's becoming more and more clear that Tyrese Maxey is a young star. We don't need to call him an emerging or rising star anymore. He's a 21-year-old star. And it's just a question of, can he be that consistently? And how much better can he get? And can he sustain the incredible three-point shooting? But he is that guy. He should be part of your core moving forward. He should be in your long-term plans. And they've put themselves in a position where James Harden is going to be here, at least for another season. And it seems like, in all likelihood, probably long-term. And that's not ideal, but that's just kind of the way things are because of the move Morey decided to make. For that reason, I think you've probably got to start looking at what can you do outside of those three guys. Tobias Harris, of course, if there's a move out there that enables you to get someone decent back, sure. But we've said for a long time that's easier said than done just because of the reality of that contract. So again, I think they're hamstrung by some of the past decisions and they have to make the best of the position they're in right now.
Depth, toughness, and defense were what we heard at the Sixers practice facility as the Daryl Morey and Doc Rivers and company were addressing the media and the fan base for the last time before heading into the offseason. So I feel you on that, Ben, that maybe not. I guess it really also depends on who you believe here. They're saying depth, toughness, and defense. Windhorst is saying they're looking for a star. So it kind of depends on what you believe in some instances.
I think they want all three. They definitely need depth and they definitely need toughness because there was no toughness on the court in games 5 and 6. I know Embiid played with injuries. He was out there. I think that showed some toughness. But in game 6, it seemed like the only guys out there that really wanted it. And no, you wasn't on that pod, so I would be interested in your take. But Shake and Tyrese were the only ones that seemed to continue to play hard. even though they weren't down by that much, even though it felt like a billion.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tobias Harris hit it on the head that they showed resilience and toughness to some extent throughout this year when things were going well or when things were going okay or when things were on the verge of disaster. But when they were in a truly bad spot that they had to claw out of, they did crumble. And I think that was the utmost example of it. Just like no showing in that game 5, I think spoke volumes that they knew in order to win this series, they needed to steal one in Miami. And 5 minutes into that game, it was evident it wasn't going to happen. And then in game 6, they were, I think, up a point late in the second quarter, despite Danny Green's injury and the deflating effects of that. And then I agree with you. The second half, there was just very obvious lack of effort from most of the players on the floor. In the middle of the fourth quarter, I think Miami got 3 or 4 offensive rebounds within a minute. And Butler, again, despite his team being up a lot, seemed the highest effort, grittiest, toughest player on the court. And Shake Milton stood out because he was at least expending some energy and providing a little spark. And the fans responded to that and loved that at least someone was providing that. So I think, of course, you don't want to chalk up the loss entirely to toughness or to say that there were no legitimate skill basketball related reasons why that got eliminated. But yeah, the effort was really poor in their 2 biggest games of the season. And that doesn't reflect well on most members of the organization, to be frank.
I think when the last pod, I made a point to Danny, and it stinks because a player I referenced years ago on a pod, Jimmy Butler, who the Sixers played against, having an adult in the room. And I know the Heat have a bunch of veterans and they have the Heat culture. And I'm not even comparing that to what the Sixers have culture-wise, but just having an adult in the room that looks around just tells people, get it together. I think when the Heat were playing bad against the Lakers in the bubble in the finals, Udonis Haslem, who doesn't play much, was the loudest one in that timeout, yelling at the coaches and the players not to go out like some suckers. And I hate to say the Sixers went out like some suckers, but I think it will really benefit them if they not only add depth and some toughness, just someone that can be a locker room leader, someone that tell Embiid, hey, get your butt down on the block, stop settling for jump shots, hustle back. Because to some extent, the rest of the team or the rest of the players on the team want to follow Embiid's lead.
I think so. Yeah.
No, go ahead. Don't want to cut you off.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's also there are certainly like huge intangible components of this, but part of it's also just the sort of players they have on the roster. Like for me, just a semi-mind-boggling stat was Tobias Harris, after Embiid returned in game 3, took no free throws the rest of the series and 50 field goals. So you just think about players who have a physical style and are going to bother other teams and put pressure on other teams. And I think the Sixers largely lack that. Now, of course, that's most glaring when James Harden takes 0 free throws in game 6 and is quite passive overall. But I think the pieces around him, there's not a ton of that just stylistic quality that's going to, correspond to seeming tough or to troubling other teams. And they also just don't have a lot of guys who force turnovers or bump other teams from where they want to go offensively. Part of that, of course, is no Ben Simmons. Part of that is Matisse Thybulle not being playable for heavy minutes in the postseason. And I think just roster-wise, that's something they need to consider that kind of bleeds into toughness in my view.
I mean, if we're going to talk about toughness and what the Sixers have and don't have, and it's easy to fall in love with who Tyrese Maxey is, but he is not a good defender, and he does not disrupt guys or push them off their spots or really cause people to change direction or what have you or along the perimeter. But with that said, with those drawbacks there defensively that Maxey has, as far as the front office goes, Daryl Morey is probably the most dialed in, engaged GM front office member that we've ever seen. I mean, you have his Twitter presence, which he engages with fans and whatnot. You have he's at the games talking to people, going through the arena, walking through the stands and whatnot, engaging with fans and things like that. And just from the things he said in radio interviews and even, the media presence that he has, he, I think, gets and understands the fan base more than maybe many others have in his position. So I don't think that he would pull the trigger on sending Tyrese Maxey anywhere as the Sixers kind of, number 2 to Joel Embiid for all intents and purposes. He would never send him anywhere unless he felt that it was a bona fide, knock it out of the park, no-brainer type of move. So, and I'm going to, paint the broad stroke on giving the benefit of the doubt to anything that he has, what he wants to do with this team regarding trades or maneuvers, because what he has done to this point, you really can't argue with, and you can't, fault him for the risk he took with the Harden and Ben Simmons trade for obvious reasons. And so many people thought he was behind the 8 ball with the Horford situation and, sending Josh Richardson to the Mavericks for Seth Curry and all that's happened. He's made some very improbable moves and positive moves for the organization. So I'm giving the front office the benefit of the doubt as far as how they're going to structure the roster moving forward. No move they have made, it may not have worked out the way you had expected it in the end. And I'm thinking like George Niang, like initially that was a great move. In the playoffs, things didn't quite work out properly. And so much of the Sixers fan base's focus is on that postseason because of all that they've endured to this point, it being almost 40 years since they've gotten past the second round more than once, and the only time being in 2001. So I think that the issue for me when I'm looking at the roster and how things went and things like that is that the toughness, shouldn't be Joel Embiid's responsibility. I feel like that's where a lot of the toughness, the defense, the versatility, ruminates from him outward. So it's like he's the center of all those things. He's the guy that's getting in people's faces. He's the guy that's, getting the technicals and all those things where it should be, all the onus for all of that stuff that they're trying to improve shouldn't be all on him to be the center of it. So that's the way I look at the team. It's like, man, Joel has to be the toughest guy. He has to be the top scorer. He's also the best defender. You know what I'm saying? So while Ben Simmons had his drawbacks, he definitely helped with some of that, as far as playmaking and defense. So I think it's just like a moment in time where we're going to think about this offseason more so as far as, utilizing Joel Embiid's prime and how that projects forward more than maybe many other ones, just because of the opportunity that they have and how far they've gotten. And it feels like they're kind of bumping their head against this glass ceiling. So in order to break through, this is going to be the off season where something's got to happen. You got an aging Harden. You got Joel, who's continued to get nicked up. You got a guy like Maxey, who's on the come. I think there's so many factors of things that make right now so important. And I figure you guys see it the same way of right now being important for the team.
It's definitely important. I just, as I said earlier, think they don't have a ton of flexibility because of some past decisions. So got to do
as far as draft picks, you mean, and capital to make moves a
bunch of moves. I mean, just the fact that Morey did pull the trigger on the Harden deal, and there seems to still be the expectation that that's a long-term arrangement. That is what it is. They got to bank on James Harden benefiting from a healthy offseason and not declining further as he ages and figuring out how to be a bit more compatible with Embiid and with Maxey and this roster. And I think based on what you saw in this postseason, it's entirely fair if you're not especially optimistic about Harden and his future with this team. But that's where they are.
Expound on that a little more, because before we take a break, Noah and Ben, we can kind of get into the Harden discussion. How do you anticipate that optimally working out for the team? Is it him signing a one-year deal and not opting into this $47 million plus contract, or is it him signing in for lesser money on a one-year deal, or is it him maybe, which probably is more likely, him having, some more years but lesser money, maybe, let's say 20 million per year over 3 years or something like that? What do you see optimally as your perception of how that should work out?
Yeah, the reality is, though, his performance disappointing, frustrating, all those negative things for fans, he is still really uniquely talented as a playmaker, as someone who draws a ton of double teams. And I think there's a certain point that you have to be over, or else you're going to make this situation extraordinarily uncomfortable and unpleasant. And it does seem like both sides want this to work, and there's going to be a certain amount of money needed there. But yeah, I mean, we heard at the introductory press conference, Harden said, "I'm going to pick up the player option." Now the tone has changed. Like, it doesn't seem like the expectation is he 100%.
Whatever it takes. Yeah, whatever it takes for the team.
Yeah, and there's a lot of gray area there in terms of what that means. I definitely think, like, being fully guaranteed with no options for 5 years for the maximum amount, I don't think anyone loves the sound of that. So I personally think something in the range of 3 to 4 years it is not a bad idea, and maybe satisfies both sides and gives you a little bit of wiggle room in the ability to maneuver as well if this goes downhill and not as the Sixers envisioned. 20 mil, it's difficult for me to believe that would be agreeable to the Harden side. I think you're probably going to need more than that, but something certainly significantly below the max amount, which would be him staying here 5 more years for $275 million. I don't think that sounds great, given the health uncertainty, given the decline in the shooting percentage and the limited explosiveness and all these qualities we saw, come to the fore in the postseason. But I genuinely think it's a tough one to predict. I'm not sure exactly how it's going to pan out, in part just because we know Daryl Morey loves James Harden and he wants to believe in James Harden, but I think there's another side of him, of course, that is realistic about how aging tends to work in the NBA, that this is a player with injury history, and that his overriding obligation is to do right by Joel Embiid and give himself some flexibility to build a team around Embiid. So we'll see how that all shakes out. But I think just the reality is, like, anyone expecting James Harden to take some sort of massive pay cut and be paid $10 million a year or whatever, and that's not going to happen. He's still going to get paid like a star. It's just the question of how much below the maximum value he indeed is going to make. At least that's how I see things.
You said that no one wants him to take the max. I would disagree. His accountant does, or whoever does his taxes, and whoever will get a piece of that pie. But I completely agree. Daryl Morey can't offer that. To see him getting paid $60 million at age 37, 38 isn't beneficial to anyone but James Harden and his bank account. I would like to hope that the hamstring issues, it's more of just something that's been lingering for 2 seasons. He can take this whole summer to get healthy. But I think everyone needs to be honest, whether it's the Sixers, whether it's James Harden, about who he is or who he was and what he is today. Because I would agree with Joel Embiid, he's just not who he was in Houston anymore. So Daryl Morey and the Sixers can't pay him like he's that player in Houston anymore. I think a good contract to or idea for a contract would be what Chris Paul got from Phoenix. I think along the lines of 4 years, 120 million, around 30 million a year. And you've seen what Chris Paul has added to that team in Phoenix. Yes, they got knocked out to the Mavericks in Game 7, but that team added Chris Paul, went to the finals. A lot of people thought they will walk to the finals this year and had a chance to win it. I'm not saying James Harden is what Chris Paul is, but I think that's a good parameter of a contract negotiation that both sides should come in with, thinking like we should be along the lines of here. The days of James Harden being one of the highest paid players in the NBA should be over, because his time of being one of the best players in the NBA is over. I don't think it's crazy to say he's definitely not top 5. I would be interested if someone had him in the top 10. So I don't think he should be paid among the top 10 players. Drop him down to around 30 million a year. 20 million would be great, but as Noah said, that just doesn't seem realistic. Give the team some flexibility to get some depth, get some two-way players instead of a bunch of specialists they have on the floor. I think that's the best move for the Sixers moving forward.
Yeah, I don't think you guys have said anything that I don't agree with. And, I'm not going to hammer Harden too much. I think that his assist numbers, playmaking, and the fact that he commands a double team, like Noah mentioned, is definitely a plus. Like, that's something that you shouldn't just ignore. But it's how do you find the right players to complement him and to continue to motivate him to pull out the best of Harden when it matters most? Because I have seen that movie of him playing small and big games several times before, and it was difficult to see the Sixers be a part of that. And particularly with the point that Ben was making that, you trade him for Ben Simmons, a guy who wouldn't shoot in the fourth quarter, and then Harden comes and does that in the same thing in an elimination game. And I feel like I can stomach Harden for 2 more years. I cannot stomach him for 3 or 4. Yeah, you're in a tough situation, and Daryl Morey definitely likes James. And in a sense, Harden's value is connected to Simmons because Simmons has this upside as a young player with, versatility, where Harden is on the downside of his career. So if you trade, one for the other, and then you don't, get to the mountaintop or at least closer to it than they had been, then it feels like you haven't, squeezed the value out of Harden, and thus the value for the Simmons trade. So I am frustrated by that, and particularly by, connecting that to all the other, missteps along the way with Fultz and not getting Tatum and, Jahlil Okafor and what have you. But I think that the way the Harden thing relates to the future of the Sixers, and if Joel Embiid is co-signing it, then as a fan base, you kind of have to go with it. So it's really, Joel Embiid seems to be on board with it. So what else can you really say? And just criticize it, when the time comes. But right now, it seems to be what Joel wants. So, you'll step in that direction. But it's difficult to see, you giving Harden all that money, and then when Joel's not on the floor, he's not a superstar or worth the dollars in order to deliver wins and success when Embiid can't play. So that's the type of player that they need to get into the fold, someone who can help carry the load when Embiid's not here, whether that's a superstar or a couple of guys who combine to have that effect, like the Memphis Grizzlies were able to do when Ja Morant was out, or what have you. They got to figure it out. And I'm not going to doubt them that they can figure it out, because I definitely didn't figure out they could solve the GM problem, hire a new coach in Doc Rivers, and trade Al Horford in the same offseason. But that all happened in one offseason. So, and what? Tell me.
I'll doubt them, because yes, they traded Al Horford. They got a coach. They got a president of basketball operations. Doc hasn't gone farther than Brett Brown in the playoffs further. farther matter of distance. I'm sorry.
I mean,
Off track.
Embiid took an elbow to the eye socket. I mean, that really changed the complexion of how the playoffs played out.
And I'm not even putting this loss on Daryl Morey, even though he was begging those guys to play hard. But I mean, Doc Rivers, even though he's begging those guys to play hard. But I mean, facts are facts. He's going as far as Brett Brown. There's no debating that. Daryl Morey, I think he has hitched his wagon to Harden when this team wants to win a NBA Finals. I think a lot of it right now depends how far the Sixers will go, what happens this offseason. Because Embiid is human just like the rest of us, and everyone has a ticket point. I'm not saying Embiid is going to demand a trade request or anything like that. He's built like Giannis. He wants to win where he got drafted. But, everyone has a breaking point. And when you see continuously build teams or bring in players that don't help you get any better, especially around your best player, what are we doing?
It is demoralizing. And again, I want to make it clear, I think James Harden, despite his faults and the reasons to be pessimistic, is genuinely still really valuable and projects to be probably at least for a couple more years. But just the morale and the vibe of the team and that sort of stuff, there were many obvious instances where he negatively contributed to that. And I remember before the trade, when we were trying to think about how he would fit here, Danny was talking about the idea of free throws and how well that aspect of his game would age. And though there were still games where he got double-digit free throws in the playoffs, obviously Game 6, 0. And to me, there were just many times where he didn't get a call that he expected to. He demonstratively complained about it. And the momentum took a noticeable turn for the worse. And his effort on the next defensive possession wasn't especially good. He didn't make a basic rotation, or he was kind of lackadaisical on the ball. And those sorts of plays for James Harden have been part of his reputation. And I think they carried over here in a negative way. And in projecting the future of this team, you sure would hope that in the postseason down the line, that's still not prominent. And that guy is still not, the number 2 star next to Joel Embiid. But again, I think, the notion of how do they add more around Embiid, taking some off his plate, the hope and not unrealistic hope is that Tyrese Maxey is the guy. He's 21 years old. He's finished 6th in most improved player voting, but I think on merit probably deserved to finish a lot higher than that. And the kid works exceptionally hard, is blessed with natural talent in abundance, might be the fastest or second fastest player in the league. And if he keeps rising, then the team's possibilities expand in a positive way, regardless of how Harden's game ages. And
Noah, do you think Thybulle and Harris can complement that, can help with that load, or do you think they're more or less guys that Morey is probably going to use in trade negotiations?
I would be surprised if there's not openness to deal both of those players. I think with Thybulle, there's some legitimate reasons for optimism. You can find that there's untapped offensive potential. That Morey and Rivers both pointed to some of those when I asked about it, and they said that he does work hard at his jump shot and he will continue to do so this summer. But for me, he's played 7 seasons of basketball since high school and has not yet developed into a player that opposing defenses feel they need to respect. On the other hand, I feel that his jump shot is genuinely better than a lot of other players who are treated as non-shooters. Maybe it finally all comes together. And alternatively, maybe you can convince another team or teams that Matisse Thybulle's got another gear that he can go up to, and that helps you get good value in a trade.
It's crazy. I think the vaccination thing affected him so much at the end of the season, man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was really candid about that too, that it really dented his confidence and his rhythm. And it just threw everything off course. He'd started, I think he'd started like 26 straight games, and then boom, he's out of the starting lineup. He misses 3 games in the first round, and he wasn't himself when he was back full time. So that did not pan out well for him or the Sixers. But I think Thybulle, it would have been a tricky call regardless on how to decide with his future. He's, of course, extension eligible. If they don't give him an extension, this will be, a contract year. He would be, a potential restricted free agent after this year. Obviously, he'd be someone whose name would be prominent at the trade deadline as well, you assume, if he's not dealt this offseason. So I think there are a lot of possibilities with him. I don't think you can call him a reliable piece of this team's long-term future. But I think, if you're that front office, you'd still love the idea of having an all-defensive team caliber player who forces turnovers and has unique defensive gifts and provides things that other members of your team lack, still part of your roster. I just don't think you can count on that with Thybulle, which is a bummer given the way things were trending and how it all went suddenly off course late in the season for him.
I would like to think that maybe Thybulle could improve his offensive game, but as Noah said, it's been 7 years since a basketball after high school, and it hasn't really improved. And to your point, Danny, or your question you asked, would you listen to offers on Harris and Matisse Thybulle? I think everyone that's not named Joel Embiid and Tyrese, everyone named Joel Embiid, if another team calls out, you have to at least listen. Tyrese Maxey, I would be more hesitant to give up, but if a team calls with an offer, you have to listen because you have to upgrade the roster. You have to get two-way players, no more specialists, whether that's Matisse, whether that's Niang, two-way players, guys that can play offensive, defense. Korkmaz, it can't happen anymore. So if any team calls, listen, I'm not saying make a deal, hear them out, hear what they're having to offer, and see if you can negotiate something because the overall roster needs to be improved.
Bro, look at how deep the Heat are. You talk about specialists. They sit there, specialist Duncan Robinson, for game after game after game and still make it to the Eastern Conference Finals with the roster and the unit that they have, the nucleus they have in order to push them past. So the Sixers just aren't built like that. When they lose any one player, Matisse Thybulle, Danny Green from the rotation, it is just they're still kind of out of sorts. They're not quite what they should be or what they can be. So it just clear indicators of the leap forward that they need to take. And the Tobias Harris stuff, I think that his worth has kind of, I wouldn't say it dipped. It maybe has risen a little bit after his performance in the postseason. He was steady for the Sixers. He was an important piece of what they were able to do. And when they were successful, he was playing well. And there were times where he stepped up when there was opportunity to do so. So I know he's not definitely in the same value conversation as Tyrese Maxey for this team, but I feel like other teams can see value in him. Okay, yeah, he makes $39 million, next season, but at the same time, the going rate for players who have versatility at the 3 or 4, he stepped up big time defensively. We talked several times on the podcast about the way he was moving his feet, staying in front of defenders, taking on challenges of guarding, better offensive players on the other teams. I feel like there is still some value there. So I wouldn't look at it as a lost cause for the Sixers to be able to move him. It does give me a lot of apprehension thinking of having to tie Tyrese Maxey to him in order to get a superstar and at the same time move, away from his contract. But I don't see a future for Matisse Thybulle on the team unless he takes this gigantic step forward with his offensive game. And there's too much at stake, I feel like, to hope that happens where it hasn't been able to happen to this point when the same stakes were involved. Like the same expectation of him going into this offseason was the expectation of him going into last offseason of, getting locked in the gym and improving his 3-point shot and his offense. So I am willing to cut bait and move on from Matisse. I don't think it's as urgent as Tobias. I feel like Tobias you continue to kind of wait and see and let things develop. And maybe closer to the trade deadline, you might have, more of, ammunition that way. But I'm definitely ready to move on from Matisse.
I feel like you're really just trying to bring out the president of the non-Tobias Harris fan club right now. Like,
bro, you
wait
can't
and see
front,
for what?
Bro.
Wait and see for what?
Say he was playing well in the playoffs.
He was playing well, but wait and see for what? He is who he is. It's 18 and 8.
All that, you're going to come down to Tobias and not Matisse. Matisse is who he is.
I'm not coming down on Matisse. I'm not coming down on Tobias. I'm just saying 18 and 8. Like 18 and 8. That's who he is. Like, how much better do you think he's really going to get at this point?
What's wrong with that, though? What's wrong with 18 and 8? Is that urgent? Do you need to get rid of him immediately because he's only 18 and 8 guy?
I'm not saying
it's more like 20 and 9, but I'll let you live though.
No, I just looked it up on Basketball Reference. It's 19.1 and 7.1. So yes, 19
for the career or this past season.
Since he's been in Philly. All
right, well, we'll leave it at that. All right.
So look, wait and see for what? I don't think he's going to improve at this point. Like, he is who he is. If Matisse, I don't think he's going to.
There's nothing wrong with getting 18 and 8 from your 3 or 4.
Yeah. From your 3 or 4, you mean your small forward or your power forward, or the 3rd or 4th best player on your team?
He's fits both of those categories. He is both of those things.
Yeah, and why I'm okay with moving him, since I've said this for years, since you've known me, is you can't pay your 4th best player that much money.
I'm okay with moving him too, and I hear that. But what's done is done, and that shouldn't be a priority as much as it was like a priority with Al Horford. Like Tobias is who he is and under contract and plays leadership roles here with this team. Veteran, a lot of leadership. Veteran. There aren't many guys like that on this team who are distinguished veterans like him. So, okay, yeah, I definitely don't agree with the money. I wish he was given more, but he stepped up in a way many people didn't expect in the postseason. And I don't feel like his stock is as low as some Sixers fans want to project it to be.
No, what's your thoughts on this? Yeah, I don't think I'm being harsh.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt there, but no, I think I think Danny seemed to sum it up pretty well. I think in general, like as we've said, wait and see. That's just not how Daryl Morey approaches things. He's an active, aggressive executive, and he is.
Well, why would you wait and see with Matisse? What is worth waiting and seeing for?
I wasn't saying wait.
Okay.
With Thybulle. I was just trying to lay out the many options, and that I think certainly being determined to hold on to him the way they were at the past trade deadline, that no longer makes sense. And of course, in retrospect, probably didn't make sense looking back at that decision. But yeah, with Harris, I think you would be losing some significant things defensively. And I again, am just skeptical that you could pull off a trade that makes your team better through giving him up. And of course, you imagine it would be a multi-piece deal. Perhaps someone like Thybulle is a quote-unquote sweetener in such a trade. It's just hard for me to envision, but Daryl Morey does sometimes pull off these deals that no one sees coming. Maybe he can do it with Tobias Harris. Certainly of the top 4 players, he stands out as the one that's most likely to be dealt, and where that would realistically make the most sense. Again, given
I don't feel the same pain and angst to want to move him as I have had in the past. There were times in the past where I felt like, I can't believe they're in this situation again. I don't feel that same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough with some of this stuff because, of course, we try to go into executive mode, and these guys have to be call it and calculated and think about the numbers and the money and the value. But just what Tobias Harris did in terms of prioritizing winning basketball and adapting his game and firing out more catch and shoot threes and taking pride in his defense, all of that stuff was excellent and laudable. And from an intangible standpoint, just in setting an example of how to accommodate a new star. And then also there was great on-court value. You know, he did really well on Siakam and in the Toronto series. And I think as we forecasted, you know, when they first added Harden, just having a player who can legitimately guard both interior and perimeter players, that's an asset, you know, next to James Harden. But we've known for a long time what Tobias Harris's flaws are. And we know that the Sixers would love to upgrade the roster and that he is one theoretical avenue to doing so. I'm just not so sure that it's going to be manageable for Daryl Morey this offseason. But we shall see. I think, you know, again, unfortunately, if Harris had sustained the way he'd been playing at the beginning of the playoffs and come up with some huge performances in the Miami series, of course, his value would be higher right now. It went, you know, the spotlight was on, and he's not a player who draws free throws or asserts his will on the game or tends to come through like a number one or number two star. And that shouldn't totally, you know, just negate everything positive he brings to the table, but it's the reality. So, yeah, I think he might be dealt this offseason, but if he's a Sixer, you know, to start next year, that wouldn't be disastrous, and I also wouldn't be shocked either.
I'm not saying it would be disastrous. I think it just goes back to a point I made earlier in the pod that outside of Joel Embiid, and I know James Harden, in all likelihood, will be on the roster next year. I think keeping Tyrese Maxey. After that, I'm okay with moving anyone on the roster. I don't think anyone is deemed out of the other 12 players untouchable. That includes Tobias Harris.
Flip a coin, Ben Berry, Mr. Batman aficionado, because we have, in my estimation, a little bit of two-face going on with I just think that it's like two different personalities sometimes when you watch Danny Green's podcast performance with the backwards hat Danny Green as opposed to the podium, you know, demeanor that he has. But I like it, though, because there's nothing like, you know, so many people out here want to hear how athletes really feel and then coil when recoil, whatever. They take a step back when they hear them say things really off the cuff and shoot from the hip. But Danny Green not holding back on his Green Room podcast, talking about Pat Bev's comments on various ESPN shows. And particularly Pat Bev's comments about Chris Paul and how he's an awful defender and so awful that he is just a cone. He is just a cone, as if like a cone you practice dribbling around or you practice your moves with in the off season, because that's how easy he is to get around. And a lot of NBA players took exception to that, Danny Green being one of them. And he flipped it back on Pat Bev, talking about how Pat Bev is a cone and how much Luka enjoys when Pat Bev guards him and, you know, gives him the small fry, little guy treatment. And I agree that Danny Green was right. Like, Pat Bev was talking out of pocket and being, you know, a little, what's the word? He was being a little bit slanderous in some ways, because I think it was off the mark, and also being exaggerative, if that's a word, because, you know, Chris Paul is a bona fide Hall of Famer, top 75 player. This is just my thoughts. I'd love to hear what you guys think, but it was good TV, though. I enjoyed watching Pat Bev talk heavy and talk greasy. But what'd you make of it, Ben?
I thought, well, Chris Paul, top 75 all the time, Hall of Famer. I think he's a top 10, arguably top 5 point guard all time. And
I thought he was washed like 5 years ago, and then all of a sudden,
I thought he was washed a couple of years ago. I thought his career was over a decade ago when he had the leg injury, more than a decade ago at this point. And you know how I feel about Chris Paul, because as for someone that has been the president of the Players Association, that's an adult, a real adult off the court, on the court, like the punching below the belt or kneeing and kicking and all that, it's just wild for someone to have that role off the court to demonstrate no self-control on the court. So, you know,
the way he talks to the refs too.
Yeah, like it's something there. And I think Chris Paul is a phenomenal player. It's just like when you start hitting people and in the nuts, it's just wildly childish and something there. Patrick Beverley showed up to Bristol or New York, the Seaport for ESPN. Like he was off to college. He got several different clothes for the different days he's going to be there. He got food packed. He had his notes ready just to go off on Chris Paul. And it seemed personal. And in a personal
Well, he said it went back to the
Jordan, not the LeBron camp.
LeBron camp.
The Jordan camp. LeBron camp. Yeah. So, and usually like stuff like that it might come out. It might be mentioned like slightly or hinted at, alluded to in a press conference or in an interview. It's never like that on a national platform, whether it's ESPN or Fox Sports. It just all came out. And you said many players, Danny Green, Damian Lillard, and Paul George, no dog in the fight. But they didn't sit idle and say nothing. Like Patrick Beverley went, and a lot of NBA fans already know he is a menace, but he went full-blown menace, villain. And NBA players, whether their relationship with Chris Paul or each other or not, they banded together like the Justice League or the Avengers. And it's like, yo, you're not that guy. Chill out. Like, it's one thing to critique somebody, but when it goes to personal, other people are going to call you out for that. And that's what happened.
No, they are going to be coming at his neck on the court next season. Everybody is going to be going at him.
I think it most likely would have been that way regardless. He loves the outsider's role. He loves being an irritant. I think Patrick Beverley and Chris Paul are both like that, where they get under other players' skin, but Chris Paul is the insider, the esteemed player with the accomplishments and the reputation, and Patrick Beverley is very much not that, and he seemed to enjoy that role of having a platform to just let it all out
and trying to get a contract too. So
yeah, no, he doesn't mind being in the spotlight and saying what he thinks, even if it is admittedly slanderous or quite harsh to someone who just got blown out in a Game 7, and people are feeling bad for the guy who an older player who might not get over the hump to win a title. So yeah, it was definitely interesting to see Danny Green be super candid and blunt. It was funny. So during these playoffs, Danny Green was asked about just like his advice for young players in the league during the postseason and how to deal with outside noise. And he said he learned from Greg Popovich, you just got to tune it all out and focus on internal. And he just gave a mature response to that question. And then I said, like, has your perspective on that at all changed? He didn't understand what I meant at first. I said, look, you're in the media now. You host a podcast. And he gave, as usual, a long, thoughtful answer. But it was funny because he said, I sometimes have to ignore the things I say in my own podcast. So, I think that speaks to your point about how he has multiple personas. Yeah. And when he's on the court and in winning mode, it's one thing. It's like super professional and all about controlling the controllables and being locked in. And then when Danny Green's on the mic, you're kind of get some unfiltered conversation that is not at all aligned with Danny Green, the player. So, we're seeing more and more of that. And of course, his future is uncertain here after this major injury, and he says he is determined to play again. But certainly when Danny Green's career is over, his future in media looks bright if he decides to go in that direction.
Yes or no, would you want Pat Bev on the team that you love rooting for?
For me, it would be a yes. Obviously, if we're looking at like the analysis side of it, as we've been dissecting, you wonder what exactly is the fit on the specific roster and what's the contract and all that. But no, just like the basic question.
Yeah.
You want a guy like that on your team? Yeah, I think he gets under other guys' skin, and that's like a valuable.
Hey, he's giving 100% effort. He's giving 100%.
I hear Green's point about bigger stars, have had success scoring against him. Sure, but I also think he's not all bluster. Like, he legitimately is a very good on-ball defender in most cases. So, I think Patrick Beverley has earned a career for himself in this league, and it is not just trash talk, even though the trash talk is a big part of who he is.
I would definitely want Patrick Beverley, a player like Patrick Beverley, on my team that I root for. We just talked about how the Sixers could use some toughness, some depth. If you can get someone like Patrick Beverley, like, I'm not saying the starting role, I'm not saying your sixth man, just someone that can come off the bench, give some energy, that can play some defense, that can hit some shots, I'd be completely okay with it. Menace, hard worker. I compare it to, like, for the other team, a gnat at a barbecue, just annoying you. That's what he does to other players, whether it was Russell Westbrook or Damian Lillard, Luka. Like, they all played well here and there for the most part against them. But just having someone that is like, when another team faces the Sixers or your favorite team, like, I got to deal with this guy who's going to try to get me out of the zone. I might have to get a technical because he's just going to be annoying me. I think it's a little bit of value in that.
And, of course, the toughness, man. I mean, nothing like an overachiever, especially in a city like Philly. You bring a guy like Patrick Beverley, who's kind of undersized but plays bigger than he is and is so engaging with the fans. There's, you look at how people felt about TJ McConnell and a guy like Pat Bev. They kind of are very similar in some instances. And Pat Bev would really be a big hit here in Philly, just strictly based on the effort. We're going to get out of here. We're pushing an hour here on the Sixers Talk podcast. It is a pleasure to be with you guys, as always. This is a great moment for me to say thank you to Noah. Thank you to Ben for all of your contributions to the podcast, all of your great work this season on the Sixers season. And I know, Ben, there really is no off season for you because you continue to work on all the other podcasts for all the other sports. Noah, I hope you get some time to breathe and relax and continue to, pour into the website and all the great work here you do on the podcast. Just thanks to both of y'all for your contributions and what you do so well.
Very kind.
Hey,
thank you.
Absolutely.
I want to thank myself as well. Thank you, Ben, for all the great work you've done.
Don't break your arm patting yourself on the back, but you guys definitely deserve it. And thank you all for listening out there on the Sixers Talk podcast. Of course, we'll continue to come your way as things develop. And be sure to check us out wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube, and continue to get those likes and comments, thoughts, and suggestions coming our way. For Noah Levick and Ben Berry, I'm Danny Pommells. We're brought to you by Wilmington University. WilMU Works. We'll see you next time.